Welcome back, everyone. This is another episode of Conversations on Anarres. I'm your host, Joseph Orozco. This program is part of the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures. We speak to scholars, artists, and organizers who are working to bring about alternative futures that eliminate oppression, domination, war, and empire. The kinds of futures that are inspired by the writings of science fiction author Ursula K. Le Guin. On the program today, a discussion about the future of the United States and the philosophy of social ecology. Recent studies indicate that young Americans between the ages of 18 and 34 are not particularly optimistic about the future. One survey at American University in Washington, D.C., suggests that half of young Americans feel good, less than half feel good about the future of the United States, even though they feel good about their own personal lives. Overwhelming numbers of these young people, 83%, are concerned about the state of democracy in the United States, and they feel that there's not effective government or leadership to guide people into the future. One way that many Americans deal with this kind of anxiety about the future is by looking toward the past for answers. Nostalgia has a strong pull on people's imaginations today. Indeed, one of the most virulent political movements today, right, is one that recalls visions of past greatness to make America great again into the future and to shape our politics. However, there's a kind of a nefarious undercurrent to the politics of nostalgia. One study in 2021 found that strong feelings of national nostalgia correlate very positively with feelings toward President Donald Trump, but also with positive feelings towards racial prejudice. My guest today has written a book that argues that there is an outlook toward the future that avoids a doom spiral about the immensity of our contemporary crises, and that it offers real solutions to many of the present problems that we have without the naive blindness of nostalgia. This outlook is called social ecology. My guest today is Eleanor Finley. Eleanor Finley finished her PhD in anthropology at the University of Massachusetts Amherst this year. She's an associate of the Institute of Social Ecology and is an affiliated researcher at George Mason University's Next System Studies. The book that she has published this year is called Practicing Social Ecology, published by Pluto Press 2025. Welcome to the program, Eleanor.
Thanks, Joseph. I'm really excited to be here.
No, I'm excited to have you here. I really enjoyed this book, and I learned a lot. I was familiar with social ecology before, but I learned a lot from the way that you framed the book, and particularly the way in which you uh, talk about social ecology in the context of contemporary social movements and different kinds of problems. And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how you came to envision this book. So I want to talk to you about Practicing Social Ecology, the book. Could you talk about what inspired you to write this? And specifically, I guess, how did you first come to learn about the outlook of social ecology?
hmm So I first came to social ecology in my early 20s. So this would be around 2010, 2011. And I was kind of the classic underemployed millennial uh, victim of the Great Recession. I was underemployed, I was broke, and I was traveling around, and I happened to stay with some friends in a collective in Western Massachusetts, and I ended up becoming a part of a study group with Haya Heller at the Institute for Social Ecology. And through her became familiar with Murray's work, and it really just felt like it kind of threw the lights on. At the time, I was interested in organic agriculture, and I was kind of into witchcraft and the occult, and some of this fun subcultural interests that I think many folks share who are attracted to bold and subversive ideas. And I had been raised with a real respect for nature by my mother, who brought us into the woods a lot when I was a kid and taught us to ID plants and animals and things like that. So, in some ways, finding social ecology was this like natural fit. Like it just made my own outlook sort of known to myself. And I think a lot of folks feel this way when they encounter social ecology. Like I said, it feels like throwing the lights on. And that experience for me just so happened to coincide with the Occupy movement. And just a few months after I was really reading Murray's work in depth, the movement in Manhattan exploded. There was the occupation at Freedom Plaza, and tens or even hundreds of thousands of people started to take the streets all over the country and then the world, and they were organizing popular assemblies. So I was really fortunate that I got to see these politics in action, and my whole life trajectory at that point changed. And I just knew that I had to spend some significant part of my life in developing the notion of direct democracy and how and linking that to ecological liberation and sort of a life affirming outlook. Um, so that's how I came into contact with social ecology. I was inspired to write this by many people and experiences. But I think really at its core, I wanted to write this book because I wanted to bring social ecology to the people that I knew in my life, from my upbringing outside of Washington, D.C., to folks who were sympathetic to the notion of democracy. You know, again, people who care about the living world. And I think today, now in 2025, we're in this very stark reality between a worldview that is really death centered and violence centered, and then people who are life affirming, who care about this planet, who care about others, who believe in social diversity and fairness. So I really wanted to bring social ecology to the people in my life, like my mom, friends who I grew up with, who would be really interested in these ideas and capable of moving them forward, but who didn't have master's degrees in environmental philosophy or weren't, you know, committed revolutionary leftists. Um, so those are some of the things that really inspired me to write this book. But again, like I said, there's many sort of experiences. Obviously, the revolution in Rojava changed my thinking about social ecology, and I wanted to see a publication in the world that captured just how vibrant and alive this movement is. At least as I have been experiencing it over the last 15 years now. So I think, like most authors, I wrote the book that I wanted to see in the world, and that's how it came to be.
Thank you. No, I think just to pay you the compliment, the book is really digestible in this way of being able to talk about what social ecology is. And what I most appreciated, I think, was the way in which you were honest about your own sort of experiences in social movements that help to frame your understanding of how social ecology works. So it was a really good example of social movement study, but also just sort of trying to apply social ecology, like taking Murray Bookchin's ideas and sort of showing like why this is vibrant and alive. And that leads me, I guess, to, in some sense, my next question is, For those of the folks who are listening to this or watching it, may not know what social ecology really is, this view attached to the thinker Murray Bookchin. Could you explain a little bit about what social ecology is, how it's different than sort of just like mainstream environmentalism?
Yeah,
And sort of speak specifically, if you could, about one of the emphases that you have in your book is that you say that social ecology is a perspective that is really needed today because it helps us to confront what social theorists call the polycrisis of our historical moment. The fact that there's just so much going on, there's so many problems that are interrelated. So it's not just environmental stuff, but crises of capitalism, crises of failing institutions, and all sorts of things that are coming together. So how does what is social ecology? And how does it help us to sort of think about the poly crisis as you describe it?
yeah. So I'm actually going to answer this by first starting with that notion of the poly crisis because I think it's really helpful in capturing this overwhelming sense that everything is falling apart these days. And I was first introduced to this concept by a colleague at George Mason University in Next System Studies. And I found, first of all, just intuitively, it captures what I've been feeling and what I think we're all sort of experiencing. Again, it's in some ways a kind of aimless, not aimless, um, like it's a hard to place notion that there's something pervasively wrong, as well as a real understanding that the various problems that we're seeing in virtually every sector of society are linked somehow. So, what is the nature of how these problems are linked, right? We have climate catastrophe. We're destroying our biosphere rapidly, irrevocably. We have staggering wealth inequality that puts Versailles to shame when the last 150 to 200 years of social thought claims to have put that way of life behind us. We have a political standard that's utterly dysfunctional and yet at the same time claims to be democratic. And the list sort of goes on and on. And so I think a lot of the confusion in the world today comes down to a frustration with not understanding how these things relate to each other. And we're trying to formulate an adequate understanding of the problem. So, first, this notion of polycrisis, I think, is helpful in kind of distinctly naming that. It comes from the 1970s and complexity theorists. I believe the term was coined by a French philosopher named Edgar Morin. And then the concept was picked up again in the mid 20 teens by the European Commission. And it's since sort of percolated into conversations around global risk, right? So you'll see polycrisis actually thrown around by insurance companies or by, who are trying to understand the financial landscape and risks of climate change, right? And how climate change is a compounding factor for social unrest and political conflicts. We're seeing a steady rise in civil conflicts around the world. We're seeing a steady rise of displacement. And so this is how many elites are even understanding what we're confronting in this historical moment. But to me, when I hear the term polycrisis, I sort of immediately think of social ecology as really providing an answer to how are these problems related? They're related because they are symptoms of a society and institutional matrix based on domination. We live in a domination-based society. That domination encapsulates capitalism, but not just capitalism. It also includes the state and state violence. It also includes patriarchal violence, colonial violence, violence of the old against the young, and now the young against the old. They share a cosmological or sort of existential view of the world as naturally broken down into superiors and inferiors, right? That we think that this notion of hierarchy is inevitable for social complexity. So David Graeber talks about this quite a lot in his recent book with his writing partner, David Wengrow. The book is called The Dawn of Everything. It really eloquently lays out the argument that we've become accustomed to since the Industrial Revolution, that social complexity requires social hierarchy. It's like this trade-off. We think there's like this, not exactly the lesser of two evils, but a necessary evil. That's the phrase that I'm looking for. That social hierarchy is a necessary evil for social complexity. And social ecology is arguing the opposite, that in fact, complexity is a function of non-hierarchy. Complexity is a function of diversity, interdependence, also accumulation. And so social ecology is a way of thinking about how human beings relate to the natural world. And it's also a way of thinking about the evolution of consciousness, creativity, and really the meaning of life. What is it to be alive, for example? What is it to be a part of a species? What is the meaning of natural evolution? What can we know about the broader tendency of natural evolution? And how does that relate to social evolution? Can we even speak of a social evolution? You know, the last 50 years of, maybe not 50, 40 years of social theory will say that social evolution as a concept is illusory. You know, that all, you know, that we're just sort of existing in different relative moments. But social ecology really tries to, it's a method to uncover how social principles and values like non-hierarchy, like interdependence or creativity lead to certain kinds of social institutions like democracy, like participatory processes. And hierarchy as a principle for organizing society leads to hierarchical outcomes and destruction, not just of people, but also of the natural world. So this is one way to describe social ecology. Murray Bookchin is often credited with sort of being the genesis of these ideas. But one of the arguments that I make in the book is that social ecology also transcends his work. There are many social ecologists who are thinking and writing and using this perspective. There are many thinkers that Murray was drawing on to formulate his ideas, who are very important, like Peter Kropotkin. And in fact, indigenous cultures have had much of this knowledge and understanding and democratic social practices for a very long time as well. So I really try to argue that social ecology is a real paradigm shift in how human beings are thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that sort of putting this into a larger kind of intellectual context in some sense. But I do want to say that I think that, that you do mention the meme, right? Google Murray Bookchin in the work, and I want to say I think your book is a really good sort of kind of thumbnail introduction to Bookchin's um, sort of uh, diorama perspective of all of these things, focusing on domination. So, what part of it, what you do is you sort of lay out what the theory is about, and then you start to talk about, as I call it, sort of applied fiction. You sort of try to show how these ideas play out in different kinds of ways in social movements, in addressing certain particular kinds of problems in the real world. And the way that you begin this is really, really nice. I think it sort of goes from thinking about how these kinds of ideas apply to the individual, to sort of broader perspectives,
Mhm.
communities, and then interlinked communities. And so I want to talk about that idea of social ecology as a way of life, I guess. So part of what you do in the book is you talk about social ecology as what's called praxis, right? Putting ideas and theory into action, and then learning more from those actions to help refine your ideas, right? So it's a social ecology is a practice. It's an evolving theory that tries to put things into play in the world. And one of the things you say is that the emphasis of social ecology is getting individuals prepared to learn and transform themselves for even more action with other people, right? So that there's a kind of an emphasis, not necessarily, well, maybe in a kind of way of self care. I mean, we talk a lot about, in the past few years about self care, what that means. How do you do self care in a way that's not just sort of indulgent, kind of bourgeois, kind of like spa day sort of involvement, but taking real to focus on emotional, psychological, spiritual healing as part of activist practice. Um, you say that there's something to this, that we have to sort of learn and transform ourselves in order to do social ecology, to practice social ecology. Could you talk a little bit about what this kind of individual preparation means, what it looks like in practice? What are the kinds of ways in which a person can prepare themselves to get involved in doing social ecology? And in doing this kind of individual work, working on the self, what are the kinds of barriers that you have to sort of confront to overcome? Because we often talk about,
Mm.
like, in the barriers within ourselves, about like uh, uh, um, inherent kind of racism, barriers of class privilege, sexism, our ableism, right? How do we confront those kinds of things in our own makeup through the practice of preparing ourselves, transforming ourselves individually through social ecology?
That is such a wonderfully eloquent way of putting this cluster of um, ideas and provocations. So this element of the book has really resonated with readers, and I'm really pleased by that because in some ways I feel like this is where I was ranging farther afield from what many folks sort of think of as the hallmark of social ecological praxis, and that hallmark being direct democracy, right? And the emphasis on popular assemblies and confederations, which is really crucial for folks who are not as familiar with Bookchin's work. Sometimes, there's this kind of jump from ecology to assemblies and federations. But those are, again, those are sort of considered the hallmark. And this this part of the book, or kind of this cluster of ideas that I put forward. I think it's in chapter 3 that really is focused on that. Kind of really looking at the what I think I described as the interpersonal and intrapersonal. These ideas that I'm putting forward come from a number of different places, and one of them is social movements themselves.
Mm.
When I started to speak with people who were involved in organizing assemblies or trying to reach their neighbors or establish confederations, they often told me that their experiments were stymied or interrupted by a real lack of emotional intelligence among the folks who are trying to organize these groups. And as I interviewed more and more people, it became clear to me that democratic procedures have very little meaning without the character development that requires being a part of a democratic process. And so again and again, people were telling me you have to do the internal work. So I started to think about, all right, well, what really constitutes the internal work? And you just asked about that. Like, what does this really entail? And I think one aspect of the internal work is the theoretical development, taking some time to understand revolutionary history, revolutionary theory. And I think often those inquiries are really a process of self-discovery. Although we might not think of it that way, right? But, when people come to identify as revolutionaries, we often gravitate towards understanding our own position in the world. And many Black revolutionary theorists and feminist revolutionary theorists will tell you that this is a very important part of coming to stand confidently as a revolutionary. You have to know where you occupy historically. So that's a part of it. So in this chapter, I talk about study groups and really the importance of intensive study and understanding, as well as mentorship and having people who can help guide you on this journey. And that, for me, really comes from personal experience, being a part of the Institute and having mentors who were able to give me advice or, help pull me back from the edge if I was, when you're young and you're just, living your life and, in a more cavalier way, that having older, committed political individuals to help show you what's around the corner. I think that's a really important part of this process. So when we're thinking about the individual level, individuals are never really individuals, right? We're composites. We're always in relation with other people. We're always carrying around the perceptions of other people in our mind. So I think it's important to flag that this kind of self knowing has to happen in relation with others. There's no sort of just going out and doing the work on your own and coming back and say, oh, I'm healed, I'm ready for a democratic process, right? That's not actually the case. We do it together, and we're all going to make mistakes. And we're all, nobody's ever perfect. There's no coming down from the mountain with with an adequate democratic perspective or, set of skills. But I really wanted to sort of impress that this was actually very crucial and important. Also from a feminist perspective, and to try to bridge conversations that are going on right now around gender, emotional labor, and healing, and to bring those back into conversation with people who were part of social movements for direct democracy. I could talk about this for hours, right? But in my own experience and perspective, there were many people who were part of democracy movements who were really in need of therapy, for example. And there are many different modalities for therapy. Um, and but what brings those together is really a reconciliation of the body and the mind, right? And the self and others. So in the praxis chapters of the book, I really focus on this notion of reconciliation. In social ecology, we talk about the reconciliation of society and nature, that we're seeing an alienation of society and nature right now, or a perceived alienation. Society sees itself as separate, but what we're actually just doing is being self-destructive. And that reconciliation happens at the interpersonal level, and also even within ourselves. Um, the the notion that I keep coming back to is, you it's very difficult to be democratic with other people if you can't be democratic with yourself.
Yeah, no, I think this resonated a lot with with me as well. This sort of this section of the book, and it resonated a lot with sort of the work that we've done before here. Um, as well on the program, a few years ago we did some interviews with people who came out of Occupy, who were talking about reading groups, studying groups, right? So as you're saying, part of this importance is like learning our theoretical perspective, learning together. And one of the things that sort of we talked about with folks was how study groups that came out of the Occupy movement were really crucial for a lot of people in learning together. We had this experience actually here, and the origins of the Anarres project itself come out of our experiences in this place with Occupy. And one of them was a reading group that we started that went on, I think, for about 10 years.
Hmm.
And it was an intergenerational group, some academics, not all, but people who came together on a weekly basis to share articles and to think about things together that went on for a very long time. And people who stuck with it for a while often said that it was one of the most important kind of activating experiences for them in terms of turning them into thinking about what they wanted to do to get involved in the world, to revolutionize them in ways. And so I liked what you were saying about how study groups are one of these kinds of forms of learning together. It has these kinds of echoes, like you said, in consciousness raising groups from the feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s, right? And so that it's a way also of thinking about these kind of really personal aspects of our identities, gender, sexuality, and connecting them to the broader sort of political world in the way that those consciousness raising groups were. It wasn't just focused on identity, but trying to figure out like what social forces came together to make me have these kinds of feelings or these kinds of ways of thinking about myself and my life. And so part of what you say in there is thinking about like how do we get people involved in these kinds of things, and that study groups, reading groups, these kinds of places are revolutionary in the sense that they prepare us for working with other people. And I thought that that was a really sort of powerful kind of piece, because it does connect, as you were saying, the theory to much broader sort of social change, right? You don't sort of say, here's the problem, now we need a social movement to make it happen, right? How do you make the social movement happen in the first place? And that in that practice step is really important in that kind of way, because I like the way that you sort of say this, is that preparing for democracy is work. Democracy is, as we've learned, right, in the United States in the past few months, right, democracy is not something that takes care of itself. And there's a lot of sort of just like ways of life and practices that need to be sustained. And these are habits that you learn or you don't learn. And if you don't have them, democracy doesn't just miraculously happen. So I like that this section of the book really resonated for me as well, and some of the work that we've done in the past here about thinking about like what are the kinds of ways in which we can get people involved in thinking of themselves with others to help prepare them for doing things in the world that will make a difference for alternative futures. Right, and
Yeah.
part of the what. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, can I jump in there?
Yeah, of
I think
course.
you touched on something really important, and a part of the motivation that I had in this chapter. And one is that as someone who comes from a home in social ecology intellectually, I've encountered a lot of resistance and even some, mockery around the notion of an armchair intellectual, right? That our society at large is profoundly anti-intellectual. And we see that, sort of par excellence with Trump and also with AI, right? That this idea that, there's no inherent value in thinking or, having a sort of theoretical perspective. What matters is whatever you get at the end. And I think in some ways we're in a culture shift now where we're starting to understand intellectual work is valuable, but for the last 15 years of activism that I've been a part of, it carries over that anti-intellectualism, and you see a lot of poo-pooing of study groups, or that's something that I've encountered, is that people see study groups as frivolous, as bourgeois, is something that people do who have too much time on their hands, who just want to sit and twiddle their thumbs. But like you said, your study group lasted for a decade. And when you really get a chance to sit down and look closely at serious revolutionary movements, they're all founded on collective study, whether they're calling it study groups or something else. The Spanish anarchists, the revolution in Rojava, the Zapatistas, all of these movements have very deep committed practices of collective education. And without it, we don't have anything. And so I think that I was really motivated by correcting that assumption in social movements, that people think that we can just kind of jump to organizing protests or, having occasional teach-ins and webinars, as opposed to having sustained, deep, thoughtful conversations and debates with our peers, and doing it face to face if we can. And that these groups, they're not just producing knowledge, they're producing relationships. And I think, you mentioned that, like, this is to kind of where it's a little testing ground for being democratic with each other. And that made me think of how mammals play. This is a part of being the kind of creature that we are. We play, and animals like dogs and cats and things, they play as with their litter mates so that they can go and hunt in the real world. And I think study groups and this kind of collective learning and these smaller collective processes that we often see as trivial or not of real importance, they're actually incredibly important, because we're learning how to work with each other and how to tolerate each other, how to deal with the person in the room who's just a little bit extra, or how to stand up for yourself. The term that I keep coming back to for myself, and I don't like it because I think there's some like classism embedded in it, but I haven't found something better, is democratic literacy. Like, there's this whole range of skills, social skills, emotional skills, that go into being able to participate in any kind of meaningful democratic system. And those skills have been largely feminized, and they've been naturalized, and meaning that we perceive them as just something that you're good at, right? That women are always occupying these roles as facilitators, as sort of managing groups. And again, we perceive this as natural talents that someone is either good at or not good at, when in fact these are learned skills. And we're losing them. We're losing them because because smartphones are taking them away from us, because the internet is taking them away from us, and now AI is taking them away from us. Like, we are really starting to lose friendship itself is becoming a more rare and rare thing in this world. So I think part of what I feel really passionate about now is how do we start to articulate and name these skills and relationships and capacities so that we can continue teaching them. Like it is literally this, or not literally, it is figuratively the social fabric that any kind of institution like democracy builds upon.
Yeah, no, I completely I hear you on that, and I think that there's something right to that. Um, part of what you say in the book is we need this kind of work, and it's its own sort of task. But it doesn't leave it at that. It says that this is in preparation, so to speak, or in conjunction with thinking about how to be in community with others to make social change happen, to engage power. Right, so not just learning about ourselves or or being able to name problems, but actually be able to work together to use power to change things. And for social ecology, for Bookchin, this the vision there was a notion of communities working together internally, but then linking with one another. What Bookchin called federations of these kinds of popular assemblies, or later on municipalities of some sort, right? The idea of different kinds of cities working together to create blocks of power. Could you explain a little bit about what this means? This idea of federations of assemblies, and what's interesting about the book is then you sort of say, this is more than just sort of a vision, a utopian vision of the future. There are actual communities putting these kinds of things into play. Some of them intentionally, like Rojava. Right. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the idea of the Federation of Assemblies means as an ideal politically. What are the examples that you're seeing internationally, and how does it make social change happen? What's the power that these groups are organizing to create?
Yeah. So this is another like horizon of conversation and theory and history to get into around social ecology. At the moment, my brain is a little bit like it's a little bit drawing a blank. But I think one of the crucial things to remember about federations is that they have existed for millennia. That this is not a new idea. In many ways, it is a new idea, or it's a new approach to a very old way of doing things. And part of the reason we don't think of confederations as a part of our political legacy collectively as the human species is because we have not looked at those political forms as politics. So I'm thinking of how indigenous people, colonized people are regarded by Western political thought as not being political. They're pre-political. And much of the ethnographic record, especially early on in the history of anthropology and ethnology, viewed indigenous political systems as being led by, tribal leaders or, kings or, chiefs. And now we know that many of these ostensible chiefs were really just delegates or representatives that were sent to liaison with the colonial, officers who were showing up at their shores, or the religious, proselytizers, the missionaries who were, sent to correspond with them. And what we really see emerging now is that federal politics are indigenous politics. And indigenous people might use different language to describe what they do. But when you really sort of look at what are they doing, people are coming together to make decisions face to face. And when it comes time to make decisions as a larger group, they are sending delegates to one another to make those decisions. There's recently a major environmental justice conflict in Canada over the Wet'suwet'en territory, when Canadian oil companies trying to lay pipeline over their territory, which I believe they ultimately have succeeded in, although the struggle still continues. And if you go and talk with the Wet'suwet'en people, you see that they came together to protect their territory, and that this was a bottom-up participatory process that they used to determine how they would protect their territory. And so we see this again and again in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Hopi Indians in the U.S. Southwest. My own awareness around this really started to develop through a social ecologist who had gone to visit the Guna in Panama, and saw that this group that lived on a series of islands in Panama and had come, I believe, from coastal Colombia. They were using federal politics to manage, their everyday lives. So, and she came back from that experience describing their tribal elders as master facilitators. And this particular activist, she was involved in climate justice work. That's why she was there, and had been involved in Occupy and the global justice movement. And then she was spending time around this indigenous community, and saw like, oh wait, they're doing what we're doing. They're just incredible facilitators. So I think while regarding difference and the incommensurability, right, that, indigenous communities are never going to map on to Western society one-to-one, but we can see a real continuity in the principles of interdependence, mutual aid, autonomy, creativity, being people-centered, and as opposed to sort of law-centered, being creative in terms of how we're coming up with solutions to problems. Again, this form of politics is often not recognized as politics in conventional Western political theory. So federations, again, they have this long history, but we also see federal principles in social movements. And we see them, we actually see them all the time in social movements, even if that movement isn't saying, hey, we're for federations. Like, for example, 5051 right now, which is the sort of anti-Trump movement. They called the No Kings protest back in June. I've actually been talking with some of their organizers here in DC and helping advise them a little bit. And I was really, kind of, I guess, pleasantly shocked to learn that they're a decentralized organization. They don't have a central leadership. I sort of assumed that they were just AstroTurf. But actually every single chapter of those organizations is run autonomously. And then they sort of have paths of communications with each other. So I think there's a critical difference between confederal societies that are making decisions about everyday life, about land, about, how do we meet our basic needs, and social movement confederations that are primarily making decisions about how the social movement will be run. And those are often very ideologically inflected. The principle is the same, and that principle meaning being bottom up, face to face, and really sort of, I guess, what's the word? I'm trying not to use jargon. Rhizomatic would be the technical term. So being, like a rhizome or like a honeycomb, but where you're really sort of building brick by brick to a larger kind of institution, but where power moves from the bottom up as opposed to from the top down. And therefore, the meaning of top and bottom are not the same, right? Meaning that there isn't a commanding top and a obedient bottom, but rather a greater scale and a smaller scale, but united by principles of autonomy, mutualism, and interdependence.
Well, what's interesting is that you were talking here about differences of sort of federalism in sort of as a part of traditional societies, and then also as part of social movement ecology in a way. But what's interesting is that your book talks about movements that have incorporated both of these in some ways together. One, the Zapatistas in southern Mexico, right, who for over 30 years have built this independent, autonomous society of interdependent collectives amongst Mayan indigenous people working together apart from the Mexican state. And then, you have also the example of Rojava, which was intentionally built or been intentionally constructed in ways inspired by Bookchin's work, right? And so what's not, what I liked about this book is the way that you did this was that very frequently when for instance when I teach in my classes when I'm talking about anarchism or something, or I'm talking about like a society that's built on non-domination and non-hierarchy, and they're like, well, where are examples of wherever this has worked? And it was always really hard to sort of do this, like you sort of go, oh well, there was something in the Spanish Revolution, and
Right.
and indigenous societies did this here and there. um and people always struggle. It was like, well, that has nothing to do with us today. But then, what your book does really well, I think, is to say these principles that you just articulated can be found in people who are working to really try to build interlinked communities as a unit of collaborative struggle in the real world today, and having quite a bit of success at it in ways. So you've given, right, those of us who are trying to teach anarchism in a kind of way, sort of a broad sort of sense, ways of teaching this kind of stuff that sort of says this is actually live in the world. People are working on these ideas. So I think that's what I like about the section that you're working on there in that kind of way.
Yeah, I'm trying to show that people will always find reasons to be not just skeptical, but rejecting of a proposal for another way of life. I think it's very easy to feel safe in the devil we already know. And the idea of striking out into a different kind of political system is inherently risky. I don't want to downplay that. But there's also a kind of, it's something psychologically scary in saying, okay, I believe in something and I'm going to try it, or we're going to try it. And I think it's also scary to take responsibility. I've been reading Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and he talks about revolutionaries as taking responsibility, and that really being at the core of the revolutionary identity is to take responsibility for what's going on in the world. And so again, I think people will always sort of come up with reasons to say like, oh, well, this can't work. And the example that you mentioned, the Rojava Revolution in northern Syria, which has taken place over the last decade, that has used principles of federation that they call democratic confederalism. I imagine most of your listeners have heard about this in some way or another. They've really blown that excuse out of the water, particularly because they're doing it in such difficult circumstances. They've been under embargo now for a decade. They've been blockaded on, three sides. They've been under attack by the Islamic State, by the Turkish military, that is the second largest military in NATO, with not a word from Europe. They're now in a very delicate and dangerous negotiation with the emerging regime in Damascus. And again, they're doing this with very, very few resources. And yet they've prioritized the morality of their approach. Instead of saying, oh, well, we need all the resources, to then go after a good society. And I think that's people's sort of mentality now. It's like, okay, we're going to prepare, we're going to provision ourselves, and then we're going to make, the moral decision once we have our safety in place. And in fact, making the moral decision is what creates safety, and having that courage to step out into another way of doing things. They've really changed the game globally. I think we're just beginning to see the impact of the Rojava revolution in the world. And I would add the Zapatistas to that as well. The Zapatistas have put their lives on the line, not just people who are in the armed wing of that struggle, but also the indigenous people of the Chiapas Highlands who've been a part of building this system. So I think here in the global north, what we really need to learn from those movements is that you don't have to have perfect conditions. We're never going to have perfect conditions. We just have to deal with the conditions that are in front of us.
Well, that actually brings me to a question that I want to ask you is, how is this perspective useful for us in the United States as we confront an increasingly more and more authoritarian government? How can this help us? Are there examples of social ecology resistance that you know of today? What's going on that can help us right now with our historical moment?
Yeah, so I have to plug the Richmond People's Assembly in Richmond, Virginia, who have been inspired by social ecology, but also inspired by years of organizing experience and inspired by the identity of the city, and they're really working to present an alternative vision of what Richmond, Virginia can be like. And Richmond, Virginia, 170 years ago was the capital of the Confederacy and the center of the slave trade in what was then the United States, and then the Confederacy, and then the United States again. And in the Richmond People's Assembly, they've been holding citywide assemblies once every 3 months. And people are coming together to discuss the issues that they're seeing and facing across the city. Right now, interestingly, they're not making big decisions together. They're kind of just a listening space. And I think that's wise, and it seems to work well for them. It's really a way of beginning to cultivate those relationships like that we talked about in the beginning of this recording. At the same time, though, they've encouraged and helped facilitate the creation of neighborhood assemblies. So every 3 months, there's a citywide assembly, but then I think almost every neighborhood in the city now has an assembly, and sometimes it's only a few people, but they're operating in their individual neighborhood. They're working on issues and campaigns that are often specific to their neighborhood. They're hosting potlucks and block parties and free markets, and they're going door to door and asking people, what their issues and concerns are. And the Richmond People's Assembly comes out of, well, actually, their roots come out of the election last fall. And then before that, the George Floyd uprising. But this particular iteration that's continued to go on started when the city had a water crisis, and during sub-zero temperatures in January, the municipal water system failed catastrophically, and the city lost access to water for 3 or 4 days. And people had to come together to help each other. And the city, again, catastrophically failed to address the situation. So it was really up to the people. So I know their process the best because this one's near where I live, and I'm able to go and participate in some of these meetings. But I know that similar processes are going on in Providence, Rhode Island. I had a chance to visit one of their assemblies recently. That was really inspiring. I know that there have been people's assemblies going on now for several years in Detroit, or excuse me, in Los Angeles. And they've been in conversation with social ecology. Detroit as well. I've heard of people's assemblies going on there. There was another city that I'm sort of blanking on now. But we're seeing them pop up all over the place. And they're often coming from a place of necessity, in that there are real problems to address. And from what I've been able to observe, they're in conversation with social ecology. They might be inspired by social ecology, or some folks are reading, they might be reading Bookchin, or, now I can say some folks are reading my book. But they're never taking social ecology as some blueprint, right? That like, oh, we're just going to implement this and we're going to follow it to a T, and then that'll bring us to this inevitable revolutionary outcome. And I think that part of the lesson of social ecology is that revolution is not a formula. And in some ways, this might be the lesson of political economy and scientific socialism, right? That it's more art than science. And so these assembly processes are cropping up all over the place right now, and they offer critical points of hope for people. There's so much more to say about this. I also think, before, I know we want to wrap up soon, I think it's important to mention that social ecology also helps remove some of the psychic power of the far right, in that it's offering our own vision of what the future can be. You mentioned this so powerfully in the beginning of our discussion, that there's an overwhelming sense that what are we going to do? And many, millions and millions of people in this country, but then also around the world, are asking ourselves, what the hell are we going to do about this poly crisis? Yeah. And social ecology is really useful. It's just that it's offering some purchase. Like, okay, this might not be the answer, but it's a good stepping stone. And it's certainly imperfect and incomplete and all of these things, but it's a really nice to be able to have this little rock that you can kind of like stand on and say, like, okay, well, we have this, and then we go, well, wait, what about all this other stuff? Right. What about economic inequality? What about displacement? What about the fact that we're all moving all the time? How do you, that's that, I like the metaphor a lot of walking. The Zapatistas use this metaphor as well. That there's sort of like right foot, left foot. And social ecology is really, I think, really important and effective right now as a stepping stone.
I like that, and I think that's a good way to sort of wrap up the discussion of social ecology for us. I do have a question about like where is your work going right now? What are you excited for moving into the future with your work? What's bringing you hope in these difficult times? Are there any movements or efforts that you're looking towards that make you hopeful?
Ooh. Uh, I love the Richmond People's Assembly. That brings me a lot of hope. Although I think it's important never to pin your hopes on just one effort. All of this is iterative. Things emerge and then crash. Um, right now, in terms of what I'm up to, I'm unemployed. So if anybody wants to give me a job, uh, reach out to Joseph and help me out. And I'm doing a lot of thinking about what my next steps are. Unfortunately, the job market is terrible right now in academia, out of academia. But I do have some interesting thoughts that I've been writing down around these questions of the skills and capacities and relationships that are necessary for democratic work and approaches, because every audience that I've spoken with about this book have mentioned this aspect of the work and have often mentioned it first. It's like the first question that I get is around this question of how can we be better equipped mentally and emotionally to work with each other, because I think we've all had these experiences of seeing our projects fall apart because of abuse and conflict and disagreements about what constitutes conflict or what constitutes abuse, right? Like there's that really famous piece, Conflict is Not Abuse, which I think is really helpful in some ways, but then also often gets weaponized to silence particularly, as I say, particularly to silence women. Um, and these really fierce debates and issues that we've been having in movements require a lot more attention. And again, we had a tendency to sweep them under the rug or to, again, see them as not political, right? And in some ways, we're back to that age old sort of debate about the personal and the political. And there's, I think, a lot of thinking that I can contribute around what are these skills? What are what are the qualities that we're trying to embody? Like grace is one that I've thought of recently. Just to be grace, meaning to be forgiving, to be gentle with others, and patience or mercy. It's, I don't know, it might sound a little bit cheesy, and sometimes I'm like, wait, I'm starting to sound like um, someone who's religious, but these qualities that you do see in come up in religion, um, warrant, I think, our attention and thinking through how they might look in a revolutionary approach.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think we might have to have you back to sort of talk about this idea of skills of democracy, democracy skills,
Yeah,
to think about this. But Eleanor, I want to thank you very much for a really fascinating conversation. Thanks very much for this book, and I think that getting it into people's hands will make a big difference in helping people think about their own involvement in social movements and also to bolster social movements even more. So want to thank you for your work and thank you for being here.
you're welcome. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for supporting the book and for doing all of the amazing work that Anarres does. It's hard now to do revolutionary media. So thank you as well for taking that on.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you who are watching this on our video platform, and those of you who may be listening to this on our audio platform. You can find out more about the Anarres project. We're all over social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky, Mastodon,
Mhm.
and like I said, you can listen to our audio platform on Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts, and then you can watch us on YouTube. So thanks again, Eleanor, and thank you all for coming in to tune in with us. If you have any questions about the Anarres project or want to find out more, or want to suggest ideas to us, let us know. Reach out to us on social media, and we'd love to hear from you. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks, Joseph. Bye now.